Nashville, Tennessee, and then shot out the front window facing the parking lot. Moving inside, he shot and killed D'Ebony Groves, 21, from Gallatin, Tennessee, a women's basketball star and honor roll student weeks away from her college graduation, and Aquila De Silva, 23, a rapper and music producer of increasing fame from Antioch. He also shot and wounded 3 others, 21-year-old Shantia Wagoner, 24-year-old Sharita Henderson, and 29-year-old James Shaw, Jr. Other patrons were wounded by shattered glass. The bloodshed would have been far greater were it not for the quick thinking of Shaw, who jumped from hiding when Reinking paused to reload and wrestled with him for the firearm. Shaw won the struggle for the gun and flung it onto the floor beyond the shooter's reach. Reinking turned and ran out the door and into the early morning darkness as 4 young adults lay dying. Another angry white man with a gun, another mass shooting. By 2018, we had heard it so many times before. Columbine, Sandy Hook, Aurora, Isla Vista, Las Vegas, Sutherland Springs. Names of everyday places one day, shorthand for horrific events the next. Sites of death and trauma wrought by people who should not have had access to semi-automatic weapons, let alone been able to carry them in public. Yet over the coming days, more details emerged about what became known as the Waffle House mass shooting, and they grew even stranger to me. Reinking had a history of mental illness and was flagged for public disturbance across 3 states and in the District of Columbia. How had he kept his guns? Several months prior to the shooting, Reinking traveled from Illinois and then across Tennessee with 4 unsecured semi-automatic weapons. He later drove around Nashville with the firearms rattling around in his trunk and eventually carried them in full view to his apartment in town. The night before the shooting, he walked naked from his apartment to his truck carrying the XM-15, Bushmaster's version of an AR-15 semi-automatic assault rifle. Why had no one stopped him? That fateful morning, Reinking drove to a part of town populated by working-class immigrant and minority communities, to a restaurant predominantly occupied by Black and Latino young adults. When he got out of his truck, his body stood out not just because he was naked, but because he was strikingly white. The persons he injured and killed were all young adults of color. Why? After the shooting, the killer escaped on foot. A manhunt ensued, yet it took nearly 2 days for police to find and capture him, and Reinking was taken into custody alive and unharmed. How could that be? Most bizarrely, in early interviews, before pretty much everyone stopped talking to the press, friends and neighbors who knew the Reinkings in Morton demanded that judgment be withheld until the full truth could come out, conjecturing that Travis Reinking might be a victim. A victim? I'm a Nashville-based doctor, sociology professor, and gun policy scholar who studies race, mental illness, and mass shootings. I live only miles away from the scene of the crime, and I grieved along with our city as individual traumas became collective communal ones. My interest in the case was more than passing. Experts like me helped build a movement that convinced the American left and many parts of the Democratic Party that the best way to counter mass shootings, the proliferation of weapons in America, and the spreading influence of groups like the National Rifle Association, NRA, was to cast guns as a health problem. Doing so meant applying similar methods to those we had brought against tobacco companies, drunk drivers, and the makers of unsafe cars to bear on gun manufacturers, which meant tracking rising rates of gun-related injury and death and calling for accountability, reform, and regulation. By 2018, I had written academic books and articles about public health approaches to gun violence and contributed to hundreds of news segments and other public conversations after what felt like the same number of tragic and senseless events. Each shooting felt more horrific and spectacular than the one that preceded it, and each time I would think, perhaps now things will change. Invariably, they never did. I felt the same way after the Waffle House shooting. Shocked, saddened, sick, angry. A naked